subjective feelings, one spouse's subjective feelings, the wife's subjective feelings of fear or abuse, makes the husband a criminal. Well, this is spreading into other areas of the law. We're finding human rights conventions now where this principle is being incorporated, where offending a homosexual, for example, is a crime. Well, or a civil tort. It's a grounds for civil action. Offending somebody. Well, if offending somebody is ground for legal action, then you're guilty by accusation. Because if you've offended somebody, that's their determination to decide whether they're offended. If they're offended, you're criminally or civilly liable. So, turn that off.
There's a lot of stuff that happens in this whole area that you know, circumstantially lead you to certain conclusions, and yet sometimes the line of logic seems implausible. It can't be demonstrated, it can't be proven. I mean, if you look at, for example, something like the fact that consistently in the Western world now, the suicide statistics indicate roughly 4-to-1 male-female. Counter in a society which claims that women are oppressed and that men are the oppressors. It completely refutes such an idea, doesn't it? Is there a connection between what we're seeing in what you've been describing and that area?
Oh yes, yes. That's actually one area where pretty firm scholarship by other scholars have shown that. The connection between divorce courts and suicide among men is very clear. There's a scholar named Augustine Capozzola, he used to be at the University of California, and he showed very clearly that is the case. And not only the men, but the children too. If you look at the suicide rates in children, both male and female, they correspond very closely to broken homes and divorce cases. So it's not just fathers, by any means, that are the victims of this, or grown men. It's also children as well of both sexes.
Yes, but like for 30 years, I was trying to draw attention to the suicide factor in relation to men, boys, particularly young men, and this sense that there was almost bouncing back off the far wall a prejudice which was hitting young men in the face. In other words, that entering into manhood, they got this blast of hostility, which was creating all kinds of reverberations in their psyches. And you know, I mean, I attended funerals of many young men who killed themselves. I heard and dealt with situations where men have killed themselves because of family law issues, breakdown. I've spoken to people who were intimately involved in this area, and they say it's the single largest significant factor in suicide is relationship breakdown. This was ignored by every so-called responsible power structure in the land, including the media. And yet, 3 years ago, when the gay marriage thing came up, the whole issue of suicide was hijacked by the LGBT groups. Now, in 30 years, to be frank, I don't know if your experience bears this out, but in 30 years of talking to people in the area of suicide, mental health and all those areas, the issue of LGBT rights has never once come up in my hearing. Nobody ever suggested to me that there was a significant phenomenon of homosexuality leading to suicide. But they did tell me that relationship breakdown, the attrition suffered from divorce, family courts, all of that had a significant impact for certain on the suicide figures.
Oh yes, absolutely. There's no doubt about it. My earlier book contains several very concrete examples about that. And it's important to understand there's nothing nebulous or psychobabbly about this. In fact, when you point this out to some people, they will say, well, men. The problem is simply that men need to get in touch with their feelings. They have to have more focus groups, and they learn to talk about their depression and so forth. If you learn to talk about things to us, to the professional psychotherapists, then that'll relieve everything. But it has very little to do with that, actually. If you look at the reality, especially in North America, where a divorce court, for example, first of all, it can mean the loss of your children almost immediately. It can mean the loss of your home. You can be immediately evicted from your home. So your bank account can be seized, so you have virtually no income. You can be immediately forced to pay enormous amounts of money in child support, which if you don't pay, you can be incarcerated summarily without trial. Once you are incarcerated for that, you will almost never have no chance of finding a job. you're basically essentially they put you in a corner and poke you with a stick until you lash out. So the suicide as an option it's almost rational to kill yourself because you have no options in life except jail, permanent jail or homelessness. And if you talk to men's shelters, go to homeless shelters for men, they'll tell you overwhelmingly, virtually all of the residents have been through divorce court.
Yeah, and there's an interesting point there. I mean, in Ireland we have this so-called homelessness crisis, but what actually this arises from is actually a redefinition of the meaning of homelessness, because homelessness in the true sense is men living in cardboard boxes in the street for all the reasons that you described, Stephen. Now the definition of homelessness is not only in your own house and actually requiring the state to supply you with one. Entirely different concept entirely, but the reason they've done that is, among other reasons, to disguise the true nature of homelessness and the fact that it is virtually entirely a male phenomenon.
Yeah.
Just one final question before we go to the floor. One of the things that I cannot get my head around, and I've used this time and time again as a kind of a hook to try and get into this, to say to women, just ask them, don't you have any sons? And nobody seems to kind of really, women as a group, as a sex, as a gender, whatever it is, as a political force in the world, don't seem to have in any way marshaled their energies or to be even looking at the fact that all of the things which they claim benefit from as women are going to be to the detriment of their own sons in a very short time. Why is this?
Well, there are women, there are many women that are speaking out about this. I mean, sometimes the women are more active than the men. Who have met women who have been involved adversely by this, women whose sons have been through this, women whose second wives of men who have been through this. Some of them are very active and very energetic, even more so than the men. So some of them are quite heroic and quite outspoken. But we do need more. I mean, we need more of this. We need both men and women to speak out more about this. And we need to spread it, again, getting back to the theme of the more recent book, we need to spread this out among more of society. There are many women, for example, in the Christian pro-family movements, groups, who are very strongly mobilized against things like abortion and same-sex marriage. But then too many of them, in conservative groups, Christian groups, but then too many of them swallow this narrative that single mothers are all victims and that they've all been beaten up by the fathers of their children and so forth. And unfortunately, there's too much credulity here in these areas by women, but also by men as well.
There are many other sections in the book which kind of flow on. I mean, I was particularly fascinated by the description of the situation now arising from equality in the U.S. military, where the imposition of female soldiers on the American armies have created this series of absurdities. The one that fascinated me was the fact that women in general are incapable of throwing a grenade far enough not to kill themselves. So the solution to that is promote them to officers or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, fortunately this is one of the areas where there's actually some very good scholarship. I wrote that section based on 3 or 4 books by some very good writers, Brian Mitchell being one in his book, the famous military historian, Israeli military historian, another, Elaine Donnelly, the Center for Military Readiness was another. So there's actually, it's very well documented, the nonsense that's being put out about how, homosexuals and women in the military. It's clearly having a highly detrimental effect in ways even beyond what many people predicted, what critics predicted. For example, beyond simply the obvious capacity of women with physical capacity as far as being a soldier in combat, but there's also questions about it's turning the military into a huge welfare state. It's becoming the military is becoming a magnet for single mothers, because of course it's like a huge, everything's provided, education, daycare, I mean everything you could ask for. So military budgets are being consumed by things like abortion and daycare and things like that. So it's having an enormous effect on the costs of military budgets. And there's many ironies like this that come out in the case of the military, but also in other areas of society too.
Just one final thing for me.